This is Matthew Cratter from Bitcoin University, and today I wanted to talk about a major attack on Bitcoin by FinCEN. We'll be talking about what FinCEN is in a moment. But first, some context. We talked on Friday about Janet Yellen and the U.S. Treasury Department and their incompetence, and how Yellen believes that the U.S. can afford to fight two wars on top of its already current massive fiscal deficits, how she doesn't even know basic economic numbers for the U.S. like debt to GDP and how high it is. And yet, as we're going to see in this video, she still thinks that her department and FinCEN, which is part of the U.S. Treasury, should be given expanded control and surveillance powers, as we're going to see. Long gone are the days when the U.S. government cared about its own citizens and sought to do what was best for them. The U.S. is now unfortunately controlled by the bankers, by Big Pharma, by the military-industrial complex, and by other groups which conspire together to rent-seek and to try to extract as much value as possible from the people. The proper role of the federal government, at least traditionally and constitutionally, is to serve the people, not to rape and pillage them. But someone should have told these guys about that. So let's rewind. Back in the early 2000s, someone did something to some building somewhere, and we got this amazing new legislation called the Patriot Act. Who couldn't love an act with a name like that? But of course, we live in very Orwellian times, and the names of these acts always means the exact opposite. Part of the Patriot Act is Section 311, which we're going to talk about later in this video, that deals with money laundering and keeping records and the duties of banks and other financial institutions to keep various records. We're also going to be talking about FinCEN, which is short for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. This is a bureau of the United States Treasury, so it is under Janet Yellen and the U.S. Treasury, and FinCEN is in charge of collecting and analyzing information about financial transactions in order to combat domestic and international money laundering, in particular terrorist financing and other financial crimes, though it is slowly morphed into a bureau that actually goes after honest, hardworking U.S. citizens. Now, this is ironic, of course, that we have FinCEN, given that the U.S. government is almost certainly the largest money laundering operation in the world, from at least the days of the Iran-Contra affair up to the present. If you're enjoying this video so far, I just ask you to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, leave a comment, question, and share this video with a friend. So you can be sure that what's driving U.S. policy at this point is not moral righteousness. A government that engages in money laundering is not morally against money laundering. So it's not driven by moral righteousness. It's driven by the U.S.'s desperate financial situation. The U.S. bond market is dying, and there's no way to save it really without trashing the U.S. dollar. The only way to save the U.S. bond market is for the Fed to print a lot of money and monetize the debt. Because of a combination of U.S. sanctions and the Fed's overly aggressive monetary policy, people are now dumping what is literally the global reserve asset. We can see that in the chart of TLT, which has been going off a cliff in 2022 and 2023. Because of the U.S.'s very high fiscal deficit spending, as well as its very high debt to GDP, we can be sure that Fed money printing is coming and that we're going to have some very high inflation and currency debasement. This is the way that's going to be taken out, not austerity. So it's becoming increasingly urgent for the U.S. government to attempt to control or even close the exits. We talked about this earlier this year when I made this video entitled "Shut the Exits, Boil the Frogs," and was talking about the various forms that financial repression can take. Now, in the context of Bitcoin, the U.S. government does not want you to hold real Bitcoin. They'd prefer that you hold something like the coming BlackRock Bitcoin ETF, where the actual Bitcoin will be held at Coinbase, which will be the custodian, and that Bitcoin, that real Bitcoin, can easily be seized by the U.S. government whenever it becomes necessary. Real Bitcoin that you control the private keys to and that you can send anywhere in the world. Real Bitcoin is freedom money for sovereign individuals. A Bitcoin ETF is not freedom money. Real Bitcoin is freedom money. It can be sent to anyone in the world. It can be stored in a brain wallet when you flee the U.S. and take your wealth with you. By contrast, the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF, when it comes out, will need to be held in a brokerage account, a stock account, which can be frozen at any time and cannot be taken with you if you leave the country. So now that we better understand this context, we can turn to the latest U.S. government attack on Bitcoin, which came out of FinCEN. Here's the press release from the government. FinCEN proposes new regulation to enhance transparency in convertible virtual currency mixing and combat terrorist financing. The context for this is obviously what's been happening in the Middle East. The beginning of this press release cites malicious actors, including Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea. But what this is going after is something called convertible virtual currency mixing. You'll see this abbreviation, this acronym CVC. And like everything else in government releases, the language is unnecessarily complicated. But as we're going to see, CVC applies to many different things. It doesn't just apply to mixers. While we're here, I wanted to point out the connection to Section 311 of the Patriot Act, which we just spoke about. This is FinCEN's first ever use of the Section 311 authority to target a class of transactions of primary money laundering concern. And just as our efforts in the traditional financial system, Treasury will work to identify and root out the illicit use and abuse of the CVC ecosystem. So this is broadly aimed at terrorist financing, but like many things like the Patriot Act, it will have a real effect on honest, hardworking people, and the terrorists will probably get away with whatever they're doing. The main form of terrorist financing is, of course, the US dollar. This proposed piece of regulation is definitely one of the more egregious examples of government overreach that I've ever seen. Not only does it go after custodial mixers, which the US government has never liked, but as we're going to see, it also goes after basic Bitcoin transactions. I will link to this in the description notes below. Here's the full PDF, the full proposal, and it's 80 pages long. So I just wanted to highlight a few examples. Example number 1 from that same paper: pooling or aggregating CVC from multiple persons, wallets, addresses, or accounts. This method involves combining CVC from 2 or more persons into a single wallet or smart contract. So what happens if I withdraw Bitcoin from Swan or River Financial or Strike and combine it into my hardware wallet, thus pooling BTC from multiple addresses or accounts? If I set up a Lightning channel with someone, thus pooling funds to fund the channel? If I move my Bitcoin and my kids' Bitcoin into a family multi-sig vault? If this regulation is approved, I will be red flagged and reported to FinCEN for doing these very basic Bitcoin transactions. Here's another example from the proposed regulation. Quote, using programmatic or algorithmic code to coordinate, manage, or manipulate the structure of a transaction. This method involves the use of software that coordinates 2 or more persons' transactions together in order to obfuscate the individual unique transactions by providing multiple potential outputs from a coordinated input, decreasing the probability of determining both intended persons for each unique transaction. This language certainly would apply to coinjoins, which is one reason I don't discuss it on my channel, but I do discuss it on my paid course. This certainly applies to coinjoins, but it might also be applied to even setting up a Lightning channel like in the previous example. So we have to ask ourselves, do we really want to leave it up to FinCEN and a federal judge to get to decide our motivation? Were we seeking to quote unquote obfuscate, or were we just doing a simple Bitcoin transaction? Here's the problem. If the government views you as an enemy, it will always argue that you are obfuscating. And then the burden of proof is on you to prove that you weren't. This is the problem with passing regulations that have such wide and broad language. Let's be very clear. This type of regulation is clearly unconstitutional, as were both the Patriot Act and the Bank Secrecy Act from the 1970s. An unbiased Supreme Court will strike it down as violating both the First Amendment. In other words, running code in the U.S. is currently protected as free speech based on some court cases in the 90s. And an unbiased Supreme Court will strike this regulation down as violating the Fourth Amendment as well, the right of the people to be secure in their digital lives against unreasonable searches and seizures. The only problem in times of crisis, the U.S. Constitution is not worth the paper that it's written on. We saw that back in the 1930s. I made this video called The U.S. Constitution is a Shitcoin. In the 1930s, we saw President Roosevelt confiscate all the gold held by the American people and put it into Fort Knox, and then he revalued the dollar against gold. This was clearly theft. This was clearly robbing the American people of their gold. But what did the U.S. Supreme Court do about it? They did absolutely nothing. Similar to what the U.S. Supreme Court did in 2020. They weren't a very big help until much later on. Here's the conclusion. At some point, the rubber is going to hit the road, probably sooner rather than later. And we Bitcoiners are going to have to decide whether we're going to be pathetic, compliant weaklings, or whether we're going to stand up like brave men and women and fight against unjust laws. There's a long history in America of people choosing to flout stupid and unjust laws. For example, the racial segregation laws, the alcohol prohibition, the original one, as well as drug prohibition of the last 50 years, these stupid and unjust laws. In fighting against them, many people lost their lives or had their lives completely ruined in these struggles. As Michael Saylor likes to say, it's certainly much better to be a winner than a martyr, but I believe that there will certainly be Bitcoin martyrs as well. And it appears now, seeing regulation like this or potential regulation like this, that we're now at the stage of then they fight you. So you have to ask yourselves, are you personally ready for this struggle? Are you willing to sacrifice yourself so that your children and grandchildren don't have to live in a digital prison of CBDCs, central bank digital currency, and global surveillance? I think things are about to get really weird in the next 12 to 24 months. Bitcoin's price is going to pump massively, while there's going to be a simultaneous push among certain groups to put freedom-minded Bitcoiners in jail. You probably read about civil disobedience in school, and you probably always assumed that you'd be courageous enough to side with the good guys. And I think the next few years are going to show whether that is in fact true, or whether you and I prefer to take the soft way out, the easy way out, cowering in our living rooms while we watch our fellow Bitcoiners being led to the gallows by an unjust government. So I think ultimately, if a law like this is passed, if regulation like this is approved, we're going to have to resort to civil disobedience, because this is huge government overreach. What this regulation does basically makes it illegal to do the simplest Bitcoin transaction without running afoul and being reported to FinCEN. If you'd like to submit an official comment to the U.S. government, I'll link to this in the description notes below. You can submit a formal comment. I'm not sure how much good this will do. It's probably worth doing. I'm also hoping the Bitcoin Policy Institute, Coin Center, and other lobbying groups like this, other policy groups, will step up. But I think ultimately it's going to come down to you and me and whether we're willing to submit to unjust regulation like this, or whether we're just going to flout it and see what they can do to millions of us who are deliberately flouting a completely unjust law. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.